Hello, and welcome to our presentation of our poster, Intentionally Queering the Academic Enterprise, Community Research, Multidirectional Mentoring, and Doctoral Education. I'm Dr. Shanna Kattari of the University of Michigan, along with my co-presenter, Leonardo Kattari of Michigan State University. Also contributing to this conversation are Dr. Eugene of the University of Denver and Dr. Brittanie Atteberry-Ash of the University of Texas, Arlington. In the academy, everything currently as it exists is incredibly hierarchical. This includes the ideas of tenure, right? So you go from a lowly junior faculty member to a tenured and promoted associate faculty member, but you are not seen as truly having achieved your career until you are a full professor. We see this in positioning of doctoral students, first years against second years, candidates against students. We see this in the way that we talk about research, right? So that qualitative research is not as rigorous as quantitative research, and within quantitative research, bivariate is not as rigorous as experimental, and experimental by itself is not as rigorous as an RCT, right? Even though qualitative research and even small ends of qualitative research can be incredibly meaningful and incredibly impactful. So we see a lot of hierarchy in that.
We also see hierarchy in whose voices are heard and whose are not within the academy. So, for example, when there's community partnerships, oftentimes our community partners and their voices are seen as less than compared to those within the academy and those with PhDs behind their name.
Yeah, and this continues into the academic legacy idea, right? Is that if I train someone, right, like they are my academic offspring. We see this sometimes when people talk about, oh, I'm one of Dr. So-and-so's, right? With this assumption that simply by knowing the name of this person, you understand the way that this other person is going to work, and that they should get more credit based solely on their mentor rather than on the own work that they have done, the partnerships they have created, the research that they've conducted. And this continues to reinforce the status quo and creates compliancy within the academy, right? That there's this one true way to do things, that you have to move through all of these processes in this one manner, that public scholarship is not as important, that translational scholarship is not as important, and that community scholarship is not important. Even the way that we talk about gray literature, right, which gives this context that it's murky, it's dirty, it's watered down, when oftentimes community reports provide more information than any peer review research study ever could. And I think that goes back, Leo, to what you were talking about centering academic voices, right? Is that the people with the PhDs are seen as the holders of knowledge, when folks know, especially coming from a queer background, that oftentimes communities are the true holders of knowledge. And I think both of us, as I am on the tenure track, you're moving towards the tenure track, have seen a lot of this with this push towards this kind of one-size-fits-all approach. And we both are lucky enough to have had queer mentorship in our doctoral programs. But sometimes that's not even enough to insulate us from this push of like, publish in high-impact journals, publish outside of our field. This is valid research, this isn't valid research. Have you experienced any of that?
Yeah, I think maybe another thing that comes up is our approaches and the focus on objectivity and neutrality in research as well, and how we can't remove our lens in which we do research. We're not really taught that as doctoral students, or when we're bringing in the community voice, that research is not at all objective or neutral, even when done in the most ideal of circumstances. Is that our lens as human beings are always going to show up, and we need more of reflexivity and understanding, and at least having conversations about how white supremacy, capitalism, colonization show up in all the research that we're doing, even when we try to humanize research.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the idea that there's no such thing as unbiased research, simply by choosing who you're going to study and certain types of methods, what you're going to study, right? That creates bias. And then, it continues to play out down the process. And so moving into that reflexivity, that positionality, including positionality or author statements in your research. And, we might not be able to find someone on a research team that shares that exact same identity as the folks we're working with. And how do we name that it creates bias on our part, for sure. And I think lastly is this idea of these like very linear research agendas, right? Point A to point B to point C. Then you apply for NIH funding, you get your NIH funding, mazel tov, and you go off and do things. Well, as I like to say, there's absolutely nothing straight about me. And so neither is my research agenda, right? It's going to meander a little bit more. It's going to follow the needs of my community partners and what I learn from my communities. And sometimes, although I focus primarily on queer and trans health and sexuality, I also do research on disability and ableism. I also sometimes bring in kink or non-monogamy. Sometimes I do research on queer theory, right? And it's all part of the same picture for me, even though it doesn't look like a very linear research agenda. So we wanted to give you 2 case studies today, and they are 2 different research teams. They're both queer and trans, grounded in a queer and trans positioning framework, undergirding, if you will. The first is a team that was created by myself and Dr. Eugene Walls at the University of Denver, and that while it has a lot of folks from the University of Denver on it, it also has a variety of people from elsewhere. And some of us, like myself, or Leo here, or Brittanie, Dr. Atteberry-Ash, who is also on this presentation, were connected with Dr. Walls before we went off elsewhere. Other people have come in from the University of Denver's School of Social Work, where this is housed, but also from the School of Education, from the School of Counseling, as well as people have started getting connected from doctoral programs and master programs around the country, hearing that, this is a team that does really great research, that's really intentional about it, that's mostly made up, I think, exclusively of queer and trans people, and really has created that type of space. And the other is the SRG Research Collective, which stands for the Sexuality, Relationship, and Gender Research Collective. And that is a collective that I started at the University of Michigan with Dr. Ashley Lacombe Duncan, with the goal of moving away from a traditional lab model, which feels very hierarchical and top-down. And instead, we've created literally an international community of people, many of whom identify as queer and trans, though not everyone. And we have undergrads, master students, doctoral students, junior faculty, a couple of associate faculty, and community members. And that's really important for us, too, is to not just bring in community members at the end or just when we think we need them, but involving them throughout the practice. So they are they're members at the same level as PhD students, the same level as junior faculty. And what we've found in both of these spaces is the importance of just having people with shared identity and like-minded belief systems, being able to be in the same space. I think at some of these meetings we've heard, this feels like a breath of fresh air. This feels like the only place I can be myself. And we have really great conversations around everything from queering research, but even how do we collect gender in a meaningful way that's still quantitative? And can you collect gender in a meaningful way that's quantitative? And how do we look at, this is actually another presentation that all of us are on here, gender and sexual orientation, both collectively and separately, but really at the intersection of them. So those conversations, the SRG Collective is currently doing a piece on COVID and non-monogamy right now, which is really exciting, as a lot of our members wanted to do work on sexuality and especially polyamory, but didn't feel like they could do it in the school that they're at. And so being able to come together as a group with, again, MSW students all the way up through associate, actually I think we have a full professor who's on this one, has really allowed people space to do these things that they might not feel comfortable in traditional academic spaces. Do you want to share a little bit, Leo, about your experiences with either of these labs?
Yeah, I think,
lab-like models?
I think going back to that, the community partnership piece is how unique this is set up to engage the voices of community practitioners into this knowledge creation component. And so thinking about mental health practitioners, advocates who do advocacy around queer and trans issues, folks who are working on the ground outside of the academy, their voices are shared. And what that does is then builds this leadership pipeline of those voices into the academy, not just formally in terms of academic positioning, but also as parts of folks who are writing journal articles and creating that knowledge that's sitting there, which is crucial for thinking about how we queer the academy.
And I also love that what comes out of this is not just peer review publications, but pieces in Medium, pieces in the conversation. We've talked about creating artwork. We've talked about creating videos. Really thinking about the importance of public scholarship and the ethicality of how do we disseminate this back to our communities and the people of whom this is most important. So I know we're hitting our time, but we wouldn't want to leave you without best practices towards these transformative approaches. And again, thank you for bearing with us. This was supposed to be as an actual hour-long talk and dialogue, and we're having to kind of squish it into a poster. So with that,
number one, we've mentioned this many, many times, is let's get rid of this hierarchy, right? There's no one better researcher than anyone else, regardless of their training and education. Everyone has something to offer to the research process, regardless of that positioning.
Yeah, everyone learns, everyone teaches, right? And I think that's super important. I saw a meme a while ago that talked about the importance of everyone 35 or older should have a mentee, or have a mentor, sorry, not a mentee, a mentor who is 35 or younger, right? Because again, I think about how much has changed in the language of trans community and language of queer community over the past few years. If you are not talking to younger people about these things, you are going to get lost out in the cold and become that old crotchety dinosaur that's still doing things the same way that they did 35 years ago, and not really trusted by the community. Another way to build that trust is community partnerships, again, at all levels of research. So creating space to support your community partners, go to their events, donate to them, ask them how you can support them. Don't just come to them when you have an idea for a grant. And a lot more institutions are moving towards models where they're giving small pots of money to develop community partnerships. Some of them are called Breaking Bread grants. Some of them are community partnership development grants. For a couple of thousands of dollars, I really encourage people to go after them and start building partnerships now. And you're going to have much better research down the line.
And community partnerships also help us to have more of a lens and prioritize the public and translational impact of our scholarship. Because when they're sitting at the table, they'll help us keep that lens of how can we apply this to actual communities and to actual work and actual social problems.
I do want to give a push for critical pedagogies. Regardless of whatever field you're in, your research should attach to practice somehow, whether that's medical and healthcare providers, whether that's mental health providers and therapists, community organizers, policymakers. We have to connect the work that we do to changes in practice. And so really thinking about how do we teach about these things, and how do we teach emerging scholars to talk about their work in a way that's meaningful and that creates change rather that just reinforces these kind of academic norms.
And that includes that to get to your goals that you want to do, it's not just a straight line, and that we can queer our research agendas to help us achieve our goals in terms of whether it's pedagogy, whether it's scholarship, whether it's community impact, and that we can queer research approaches too. We don't have to do it in one special way that is what's traditionally valued as rigorous in that scientific method. There's lots of ways to do really incredible, impactful research, and so let's make sure we're using those different ways.
And I will say, as someone who's been involving a lot more arts-based methodologies, I'm always shocked, especially when it comes to sexuality research, in general, how little there is around photo voice, digital narratives, poetic inquiry, autoarchaeology, autoethnography, really encouraging people to make these deeper connections with sexuality that can be such a fraught topic, and also something that's not easily captured by a survey or some of the quantitative methods that we tend to use. And what I will say is I've often been given pushback about, is there space for this? Are there people that actually want to do this? And so I, a totally non-sportsing queer, will take a line from a sportsing movie and say, if you build it, they will come. The group I started with Dr. Walls years ago, back in 2013, originally there were, I think, 3 of us students and Dr. Walls. And now there's literally dozens of people that come on our bi-monthly calls. Similarly, with the SRG Collective, it originally started with myself and Dr. Ashley Lacombe Duncan and a couple of MSW students who were working with us. And again, now we have 50 something members on our listserv. We just had our first ever multi-day writing retreat that we had, I think 14 or 15 people come to over a few days. We usually get 24 people on our virtual meetings every time we have them. And more people are wanting to join and connect. And what we would love is, first of all, people are welcome to join with us. That's srgcollective.com for more information. But we want you to also be creating your own queer spaces and your own queer research and mentorship so that people don't feel like they have to find something else, but that these exist in the spaces that they're already in. So with that is our poster. Thanks for listening to us.
Yep, thanks a lot.
And we look forward to seeing you in queer spaces.